Hi, I'm doing things a little bit differently today because I'm in a bit of a hurry and I haven't written anything, so I'm just going to tell you about a couple of things I got online. I bought a couple of MIDI guitars, entry-level things, used for cheap, really cheap, so that's, cool. I'm not a guitarist. But I'm not a keyboardist either. I'm a drummer. But when I make music in sequencers, I tend to be better with a keyboard on melodies, but chords not so much. I'm okay with chords on a guitar. So MIDI guitars can be quite useful for that. The two guitars that I found are the Mad Catz Rock Band 3 Fender Mustang Pro-Guitar, and the other one is the Inspired Instruments U-Rock guitar. Both of them have kind of tricky names, but they both have capabilities as controllers for rhythm games. One is even primarily made specifically for Rock Band 3 Pro Mode, but I won't get into that because I don't play rhythm games. Nor will I get into the details of the U-Rock guitar's built-in practice modes. This review is purely about music creation use of these guitar tools. So let's get started. This is the Fender Mustang by Mad Catz. It's a MIDI controller and a game controller, nothing else. The design is a replica of the Fender Mustang, obviously, to the point of even having the logo on the headstock. It's pretty nice looking, but very plasticky. But that's understandable because it's plastic. The neck is quite nice. It's got these elevated buttons, which it's easy to do. Bar chords, you can easily push them down. The frets are quite wide, so it's fairly easy to do those kinds of chords where you need a lot of space for your fingers. So, now the fact that it's a MIDI controller means it's not an instrument. You can just control other instrument with it. MIDI is a digital language in which instruments and controllers communicate. And I'm currently controlling a virtual instrument in my computer. And the latency is pretty low. If I had a very slow computer or a regular built-in sound card, it would take a moment between striking the string and hearing the sound. Now, strings, these little pieces here, these are the trigger strings. So each button represents a position on a fret on a string. So that's why there's 6 rows of strings, and there are all these different frets. Now, the headstock has a wood grain print, which looks a little bit cheesy, but it's all right. Looks okay from afar. It stops your hand when you get to the end of the thing, so it helps you, even without looking at it, where your hand is. This is quite useful. And even if you remove the headstock, let's see, there's still a slope here for your thumb, so you still feel it, but this helps you see it as well in your peripheral vision. And the chords are obviously done the same way as on a real guitar, but you can't do hammer-ons. It just goes quiet. Same thing with pull-offs, just mutes. Open strings you mute by pushing buttons because you can't just do this. That doesn't do anything. There's no mute system like that, like on a more expensive Z-tar, for example. Those have a mute system where you can basically just touch the strings and it mutes, I think. I'm not entirely sure. I've never used one. But those are more expensive. These are entry-level, plus they're used. So if you can find used ones for cheap, then, it's quite useful for inputting chords into your sequencer. However, you take a chord, you let go. Some of the strings are still playing because obviously open strings. There's no, as far as I know, there's no like setting for making those open strings stop when you release the other strings. Let's see, and it has no pitch bend. It has octave up and down, like if I do this. The strings are pretty sensitive, so you can do a bit of finger picking, though it probably helps to have longer nails, but it works okay. Doesn't take a whole lot to trigger a string. Though a plectrum is obviously helpful. Let's see, what else is there to say about this? It doesn't have USB, so it needs batteries. I don't think it eats them too fast. I haven't had it for that long, so I don't know for sure. It has DIN MIDI 5-pin, which looks like this. That's the old style of MIDI that's been around since the 80s. It doesn't do USB MIDI because it doesn't have USB. I don't think it does wireless MIDI, though it has wireless capabilities for the Xbox. This is the Xbox version. There's also a Wii version and a PS3 version, I think. But this is the Xbox version. It has wireless, but I don't think the wireless can be used for MIDI unless you do some science, which I think there are some people who have done some science and figured out that. I can't say anything about the latency on the wireless if you manage to figure out how to do that, but there are like conversion cables from DIN MIDI to USB in case you don't have DIN on your sound card, but a lot of sound cards do. Like a lot of good external sound cards, not the built-in ones usually. But also it has a foot controller input for expression or stomp switch. So you can have both analog and digital foot control, which can be mappable to modulation and various things, sustain, stuff like that. Though I don't know exactly why you would want a sustain pedal, because it's pretty much the default. But maybe something to stop the sustain. I don't know if that's mappable. Probably. Maybe. That's probably something to check out if it is. Also, it has, if you push this button here, it goes into tap mode. So you don't have to trigger the strings. However, obviously, the only way to trigger the open strings is to do like that. Problem is, there's no muting that. Like, if you hit and you hit the strings, they're just gonna play where you hit them because your tap mode's on. So that's the little problem. There's no mute for the open strings in tap mode. But if you're just gonna use this to like play little melodies and input chords into your sequencer, it's quite effective. It does the job. It's not great for like playing solos. It doesn't have hammer-on and a pull-off. So there are limitations, but there are also strengths. And it has a fun classic design to it. So that's the Mad Catz Rock Band 3 Fender Mustang controller MIDI capabilities. In some VSTs, you can also use these two buttons to flip between different presets, and I think you can use the D-pad for something. But somebody, I think, was working on a patch for using this thing as a pitch bend and modulation, which, you know, is an interesting idea. Also, somebody was, maybe the same person was working on a patch to use the accelerometer to control filters and stuff by tilting, but that's, you know, homebrew stuff, so that's not something you can sort of expect to do out of the box. That takes some tinkering with software, presumably. But I find that this is quite useful for certain things. So those are the strengths and weaknesses of this. Now let's move on to the other guitar, the U-Rock guitar by Inspired Instruments. The U-Rock guitar is a MIDI controller and has a built-in sound module, which means that it's a standalone instrument as well as a controller for other instruments. The sounds that are built in range between awful and decent. You can use one guitar sound and one synth sound at the same time. I'm using synth they're using synth. There's a synth button here, it says synth on it. But they're using the word synth in a very sort of loose way because the synth category includes piano, vibraphone, strings, trumpet, various things. They're not excellent sounds. They don't sound entirely realistic, but you know, some of the sounds are pretty decent. I'm not going to scroll through all the sounds because that's just going to be far too boring. The design looks like they couldn't quite decide between if they should make it look like a real guitar or not. They probably should have gone full spaceship, but instead they went sort of in between because the main body here looks kind of, you know, spacey, but then there's the neck, which has a sort of wood color and even has a wood grain texture on the back, even though it's plastic. And it's like, if you're gonna go spaceship here, why not go spaceship here as well? You know, they could have made this also black with a white grid, or made it white with a black grid, or made it, I don't know, gray, metallic, I don't know, but like the wood color just, it seems a little bit out of place with the black, but that's okay. The frets are kind of tight, so taking certain chords like this is a little tricky. Now the reason why you can hear more sounds here than on the other guitar is because I've got it plugged in two ways. I've got the audio cable, so I'm using the internal sound, and also the internal sounds are two at the same time. And then I've got the MIDI cable, which is controlling two sounds in the computer. So I've got four sounds at the same time here, as opposed to the other one, which was playing two sounds just in the computer, and this one has two sounds of its own. So oh yeah, this one does have pull-offs. If you're on a bar chord, if you're doing, you can't pull off to an open string. Excuse my English. I'm Swedish. Also has tap mode, and it does have hammer on. So that's pretty useful. Like I said, tight frets, fingers kind of spill over into the next fret sometimes. So if you're trying to take an A, sometimes you end up with, which is sometimes not what you're looking for. So you gotta sometimes keep an eye on what you're doing. Also, there's no headstock. There's a headstock prototype, but it's not available. So that's, I think, something they should probably release for cheap. Because a headstock would be useful, not just for show, because it would stop the hand, it would be a peripheral reference. As it is, you kind of slide off, and you don't really know where you are on the neck. So if I'm not looking and I want to do an A, I might end up... Well, I won't end up there, but I might end up there. and that's not an A. That's an A. And, you know, I might even end up... So, it's a little unfortunate that they didn't come with some sort of headstock or some sort of slope here to stop the thumb. Something for reference would have been nice, but it's no big deal. You get used to it over time, probably. The grid, this one doesn't have buttons. It has instead a grid, which is sort of rubbery, and is supposed to imitate strings, but they're not elevated like the buttons on the other one or like strings on a real guitar. So when you do bar chords, you might not be able to hit all the strings because of your finger not being a tube shape. There are little folds in your finger, and sometimes a string will slip between. And on a regular guitar, that would just mean that the string would get muted, but on both of these MIDI guitars, you obviously can't mute a string by putting your fingers on it. So when you're playing a bar chord, you might end up with something that's not quite right because you're not pushing hard enough with your bar finger. So that's something that's a little unfortunate, that they didn't elevate the strings a little more or create some sort of a mute system, because it's a little inconsistent. If the strings were more elevated, it would be easier to do those bar chords. But also a matter of probably practice and making your fingers fatter, I guess, or putting a piece of tape on your finger. I don't know if that would work. Or wearing rubber gloves might work. I don't know. If you're doing a chord with some open strings and you let go, all of the strings go quiet if you have that setting turned on. So there's a setting for that. You can turn that on and off so that they either hang on like the other one or they end when you release it. So I like that setting because it sort of compensates for the fact that you can't just do that. Well, I guess you can do that, but you can't do that. It has hammer-on. You can turn that on and off. And also you can set how much you want the hammer-on to be delayed. I was confused at first. At first I thought it was some weird latency issue, but it turns out there's a setting that you have to turn off to get rid of the delay on the hammer-ons. I don't know exactly what that's for, because it seems to me useless to have a delay on your hammer-ons. But maybe it's in case you regret it. I don't know. Anyway, I find that I prefer to have that setting turned off. So you turn that off by going into a menu by using these buttons. It's a little tricky because there are diodes that you gotta navigate, and it's a little tricky because it's a very minimalistic interface. Or you can use the more visual interface that is available for the PC. It's also available for Mac. Octave up and down, there aren't buttons for that. I hope they upgrade the firmware to include button up and down here or something, because these buttons are just, right now, they seem to be just switching presets. But you can switch the presets from here. So it seems to me that why not just make these be the octave up and down? That would make sense to me. However, there is a whammy bar for pitch bend, and you can set the pitch bend to 1 or 2 half steps. You can't set it to a full octave, which I think is a little unfortunate. Again, I hope they fix that in a future firmware upgrade, because sometimes you want to pitch an entire octave and you can't do that, so you can't pitch further than that. And of course, a modulation joystick here. Obviously, they made it a joystick so that you can have use for it when you're using this as a game controller. Now, about the game controller thing, if you're going to use this with Guitar Hero or Rock Band and not use it as... I think it can be used as a pro controller just as it is, but if you want to use it as a controller for like standard modes or the easy modes or whatever they call them, then you need a cartridge, and I think they sell those for different consoles. I don't have one because I don't play those games. Well, there's a 1/4-inch jack for plugging into your guitar amp, and there's stereo in and stereo out, which are the smaller jacks. And there's the USB for power and MIDI, and also upgrading the firmware and controlling it from the computer. And also the 5-pin DIN MIDI, like on the other one. So this one has more options. Both MIDI ports can be used simultaneously with internal sound module, which I'm doing right now. Now, like I said, I'm not a great guitarist, so I'm not going to play any cool solos or anything, but there's quite a bit that can be done with this if you get used to the tight frets. Now, both of these guitars have very low latency on the MIDI output, and the latency depends pretty much entirely on the receiving device. Although the built-in sound module seems to have varied latency between different sounds, some very low and some slightly annoying. But this seems to be either because some of them have like effects, like distortion and reverb and stuff that might slow it down, or it might be because of bad sound editing, like somebody didn't cut the sound late enough, so there's a little gap maybe. Because I've found that some of the sounds have a slight delay. Don't know that this one has much of a delay, but I'm noticing a bit of it. So that's the built-in sound module is not 100% well done, but it works. It does what it does. So that is the U-Rock guitar and the Fender Mustang Pro-Guitar. And all in all, I would say that I prefer the U-Rock guitar, although there are some strengths to the other one as well. The Mad Catz guitar has its perks, such as octave up and down, and a nicer fretboard. Fretboard here is a little tight and takes a lot of pressure. So those are some of the differences between these two entry-level MIDI guitars. And if you're thinking of getting one, I would more recommend this one than that one. But if you can get that one for cheaper and you just want to input chords, get that one. But if you want to do more stuff, get this one. If you're thinking of buying them for full price, new, then I would recommend that you have a lot of money. Well, it's not that expensive. There are much more expensive MIDI guitars out there, but if you're low on money, like myself, don't get these things new. Just look around on the auction sites and shit for cheaper ones, because they turn up, and you can get them cheaper used usually than new, which is what I did. So, that's the end of this review. I wonder if I can cut some stuff out of this, because it's a little bit long. I'm in a little bit of a hurry to get this done. I'm not going to beat the deadline, am I? Bye. That's a little awkward ending.